Chapter 4. So you want to see. So one brisk evening on an autumn day, I rode up the mountain on my Honda 175 on that 12-mile stretch of road that I'd walked back and forth on so many times. I was finally enjoying the trip. I crested the mountain, which was about at the 3,600 foot elevation, then taking a left 8 miles off that paved road, then another 8 or 10 miles on 2 different dirt roads. Once at my destination, I would have to ride off of that road and onto an even narrower dirt road for several hundred yards down to Nofus Creek, and then walk from there about another quarter mile or so on a deer path till I reached my campsite. There I loaded the rest of my clothing and personal stuff like my razor, soaps, extra clothes, which I was now in great need of, into my pack. I realized that some of my other personal things would have to wait: my tent, my guitar, my sleeping bag, pots and pans, because I could only carry so much on my bike with my backpack. I soon figured I would have to make at least 1 or 2 more trips. Darkness was now approaching fast on this trip. The days were getting shorter and time rolled back an hour, and when I proceeded to ride out of the narrow side road where I parked, it was at this precise moment, when kick-starting the motor, I noticed that there might be a helicopter approaching my position. I don't know why I stopped. I blacked out my lights and decided to watch. It's probably my fit the profile of how helicopters fly. All I knew then was that it acted similar, but not quite the same. I could hear it cutting through the air a bit. It sounded strange. So it was interesting to watch. All I could see of it was a red hue from what I thought was its only light. It never came close enough to know at this time what it was. Excuse me. At a certain point while viewing it, I knew that off in the distance it was heading over and down the same crest of the mountain that I would have to travel on the way back to town. I decided to leave when I couldn't see it anymore. I figured it was related to Forest Service or CAMP, which is short for Campaign Against Marijuana Planters, so I didn't give it much more thought, but didn't want them to know I had camped here for almost 4 months. I drove out of there nonchalantly enjoying the evening, wondering if I would see any wildlife. I crested that hill, and then seeing it off in the distance for just one moment at a certain spot where there was a clear view of town from a certain vantage point. I could tell it was cruising over the town. I didn't think much of it since there's a small airport in town. It was now twilight, and in a few more minutes the dark of night would take over. I thought there would be plenty of people in town seeing this. It sounded strange cutting through the air. No one in town could miss this cruising so low above them. I thought it must be a normal craft to be so blatant. When I rode further down the road and I was almost in the valley, I soon saw another object that was on the other side of the gulch, adjacent to the road that followed down the contours of the hill. It hovered above the other ridge across the way and parallel to me. I didn't think much of it at first until I was adjacent to it, as you really had to focus on the turns in the road. This object was different from the first, as it was square and had triangular green and red running lights on the back and the front. Then suddenly the size of it is what amazed me. It was about the size of a really big two-story building or house, which had about 4,500 square feet or more. I stopped again off the side of the road right where there was a really big turnoff to park. It was probably a logging deck that the loggers had used in the past, and once I parked, I turned off my light to get a better view. There were two backside lights, which were green, and the front side had the same shape lights but were red. It sat there motionless and without a sound when all of a sudden a doorway on top opened up and the white interior lighting shined out and lit up the area on top of the craft, which was easy to distinguish as it happened. Then people came out. Now at that distance I can't be sure, but they seemed to be smaller than average and seemed to know I was parked within its sight. So at this point, not fearing it, I flashed my headlights at it to see if they would respond. They did. They just mimicked what I did, and the only thing I could think of was to flash the SOS signal at them because that's all I knew of the Morse code. In my mind I was told, or my impression was, that they were doing small repairs. I have no idea that was them, or I was justifying why they were there or what I was seeing. I thought it might be a blimp that needed repairs, and that it might have drifted and was lost because something went wrong. I started to rationalize as it started to dawn on me what it really was that I was witnessing. There were no anchors or ropes hanging down, no noise. Then I had an impression that the crew was being held against their will, which seemed very strange. I forgot about the craft I had seen earlier, and I comforted myself, thinking that it was one of ours. But at this moment, panic slightly entered into my thoughts. Some of my thoughts were that I knew that our government didn't have anything like this in their arsenal, as I was trained to observe and recognize planes and military of different nations, including distances and sizes. Even a blimp could not be that still while floating and anchored. People would not be inside of its main body, not like that. And opening the top would let out its gas, or maybe not. When my mind finally came to realization and a conclusion that this wasn't a blimp, I became stunned a little. I tried to use reason and logic, but still what I witnessed wasn't what I hoped and thought it to be. I also thought that maybe the object with the extreme red light was a military or rescue chopper investigating a problem. One can only hope. I waved to the people on top of the craft. They waved back. They seemed friendly enough. Then all of a sudden, the craft, with what I thought only had a red running light on, was coming back. I knew I didn't have much time now. I didn't expect, and what I seen startled me. The whole craft was a red, glowing light. What I received in my mind during all this was that they were doing repairs, and they were friendly, but their leader, who was in the glowing red object, was not exactly like them, and I was sensing that they feared his rule or command. In my mind, I asked who was in the red ball, who was flying it, and not really expecting an answer. If it was what I suspected it to be, or at least hoped for my own sanity, it wasn't, and who I now thought they were, I might get more answers, as is commonly known by all that I read about the subject long ago, Mind to mind, the answer came back. Something said the beast. WTH is what entered into my thoughts next. And then I realized that the hair on the back of my neck stood up and fear entered into my perfect evening. I started to question this reality that I was now witnessing. The red glowing craft pulled up and docked with the square object without hesitation now, and did this in a perfect motion. This object was about 40 feet across and never touched the square object, and now both were hovering and perfectly still. It was a clear night, and I could tell the size because both blocked out the star field that was visible from behind them, and my close proximity undeniably, along with a very little light emanating from them, made it easy, using the trees in the background, to figure out the sizes of these crafts. It was about this time that all the occupants that were on top went back into it and closed the hatch, and the light that emanated from within on top was gone also. I was expecting the military to show up at any moment now, but they never did. I was thinking to myself, there is a flaw in our system of the way we observe our airspace with our technology, and then realized that they could probably get away with even more if they stayed below any radar capabilities. It also dawned on me that they, whoever they were, possessed a great amount of power to be able to make that amount of mass just sit there and hover without a sound from their equipment. The fear grew even more now because I was alone and it started to move. I had been in and around USS Steele's electrical motor rooms that drove the different mill rolls, and those were about 15 feet tall, driving the big mills and the billet mill. But this was muffled more. It had a sound emanating from it like those motors. As it sped up, the sound increased in pitch. The view I got was unbelievable, and so close I can't describe it any better except than to say it was made of a metal of some kind or had a solid surface, and as far as volume, it was about the same size of a battleship. The shapes were different. The main thing was they were moving with an electrical drive that was not visible, or without any drive visible on the outside of its hull. The only thing visible on the round craft was the glow of red. It banked hard left, tilting slightly on its left side, then proceeded around the mountain's contour to my left and behind me and the road I was on. It was almost directly above me at a certain point. It was then headed due west at this point at a very high speed around the mountain and out of sight. "You were right under them?" someone asked. Pretty much. It only took a split second to realize that, and about that time, it was too late for me to move. All I could do was sit there and observe its departure with a weird sense of fear, hoping they didn't care about me observing all this. There was never a variance in the dock distance between them as they moved together. They both seemed to be locked in place. Each of the two objects never touched each other, nor was there a tow line of any sort. It was as if they became one vehicle. It went from hover to slow movement, all the while progressively increasing its speed, moving from a southwest heading according to its parked position, and doing a half circle towards me to the northwest, leaving the ridge where they had been in hover mode some 50 feet above the tree line to directly above me on the road. The trees were at least 100 to 150 tall with some variances. I could say they were about 800 to 1,000 feet above me now. When it crossed Tule Creek and the road, I could then hear its propulsion sound clearly, and it was electrical in nature and was picking up speed with no visible propulsion units on its exterior, while steadily the sound, the pitch, increased. I then started up my bike and headed to town, glad to get away from there. At the time, I had no idea how they could have moved without engines, jets, or propellers on the outside of its fuselage, or at least not yet anyway. When I returned to town, it was dark at about 8 o'clock. As I entered the bar, as I always did for some food, but I decided to have a double rum and coke first to calm my nerves. Mickey said, "I thought you didn't drink." I said, "I do now." She said she sensed something was wrong and asked, "What's wrong?" I said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." She said, "Go ahead, try me." They were so cool, her and Jerry. They had both tended the bar there for years. So I figured, what the hell, and I related the story. She then told me, "Seeing those things up here is common." Then added in her own words, "People up here see these things all the time. Don't worry, you're not the only one. You'll get used to it." I asked, "What do you think they're doing here?" Most people feel they need the same resources that we do, the platinum, the gold, different metals and crystals that are readily available up here in just about any creek or stream. They think they need it for some of the reasons we do, electronics mostly. This made more sense to me later as I'll explain what I discovered about the properties of gold, and that was the best answer I could expect or accept. My skepticism was now extinct. My good friends listened as I retold how I found out about the technology we were working on and perfecting at this very moment in time, because they knew this to be a true working example of what I related to them so far. They wanted to know more, and during this conversation, they asked many questions that I will not state here. They never suspected and had not thought about the dangers of such a discovery. I was about to educate them on every contingency of such a device. Everything we have, even up to now, might be able to be somehow to be turned into advanced weaponry by the powers that rule us, and make no mistake, that is what they will try to do. We have to somehow keep that from happening. As night wound down, I got tired and said, "Let's finish this tomorrow." Magic stood up, and as he walked away ready to sleep, he said, "Remember the rule to keep all this to yourself while at our regular jobs and travels. Till tomorrow, mates. I bid y'all good night." So the party slowly ebbed away, and we all went home one at a time, alone or with family. I stayed and helped Drew put out the fire and clean up, and asked him what he thought about UFOs. Well, I can't rule them out as a whole, because even I have seen something weird one day over the swamp. So it's very plausible. "What did you see?" I asked. "Just the classic disc while hunting hogs out behind the shop in the swamp one day. They seemed to be taking in water, don't know why, and then it seemed to sense me and just took off. I never gave it much more thought." "Why not?" I asked. "Because people think you're crazy when you tell them this kind of stuff, and there isn't any hard evidence." "Kinda like you have to do a self-check then, right?" I asked. "Yes, of course you have to, eh?" Drew was a skeptical, militant, agnostic type who didn't believe in religion per se, but had an open mind slightly to the existence of a possibility of God and extraterrestrials, or in a simpler term, aliens, which for the most part skeptics poo-pooed away as they did with everything that was new or unknown, in most instances even with proof. They were more willing to say people were just hallucinating or delusional at the time of an extraordinary event than to admit they actually saw the real thing. But being in total denial to me was like sticking your head in the sand with a closed mind, but that's just me. He's still my friend, though, like other skeptics and atheists I know, and he was still open to the possibilities of all possible scenarios when and if proven. Proving what we all want to know wouldn't take us too long. So why was I reliving all of this? And the only answer that popped up in my mind back then was that we are allowed to know what we can handle. Now, as I viewed this, the voice told me, "You were chosen." Then I continued to see what I was supposed to. Next, Chapter 5.